Happy Wednesday, Mount members and friends. Welcome to the sixth lesson of our fall Bible study series, The Politics of Jesus. If you don't mind, take a minute and share this video with family, friends. If you're watching on Wednesday at noon or 6:30, we are live on Facebook, 6th Mount Zion Baptist Church, Richmond. That's our Facebook page. Or you can go to our YouTube page, SMZBC Worships, all one word, worships with an S. Or you can just jump on Dialpad Meetings and you can download the app, or you can just call 804-203-9011 to listen. As a quick recap of where we've been over the last few weeks, strategy 1 is to treat the people's needs as holy. Strategy 2 was give a voice to the voiceless. Strategy 3 was to expose the workings of oppression. Strategy 4 was to call the demon by name, and strategy 5, which was last week, save your anger for the mistreatment of others. That leads us to today, strategy 6, take blows without returning them. Today's scripture lesson comes from a very familiar passage in the Gospel of Matthew, which is a part of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount.
You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth.
Yes, Rabbi.
But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you.
This brief passage from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount is extraordinary for its ethical and moral content. Some Christians believe that in addition to giving instructions and personal ethics, it also expresses what they understand to be the essence of Jesus' political teaching. They believe that his political message is this, that those who follow Jesus should be stoically passive in the face of oppression. For them, do not resist an evildoer. That says it all. The proper response to painful political realities is quietism, non-involvement, and long-suffering. But when we look at the context in which Jesus was speaking, we see that, contrary to popular opinion, Jesus was not counseling passivity. Those to whom Jesus was speaking were not people with social or political power, but those who lacked it. Jesus was not speaking to the abusers, but to the subjects of abuse. Quote, if anyone strikes you, wants to sue you, forces you to go 1 mile, unquote. In other words, Jesus is not making a general statement. Jesus is speaking specifically to those whose social, economic, and political standing make them walking targets of humiliation and abuse of power. And what he is telling his poor and powerless hearers is how to exercise power even when they are overpowered. So, once again, we're going to go deeper and see what Jesus was really saying in Matthew 5. I know you heard the phrase, turn the other cheek. If you are a parent, you very well may have taught that to your children. But do you know why Jesus specifically said if someone slaps you on your right cheek? Well, it turns out that hitting someone on the right cheek implies a left-handed strike, which wouldn't necessarily make me think twice, but apparently the left hand in Jesus' society was thought to be unclean or evil. So using it to initiate an action was taboo. For example, in Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls community, a left-handed gesture carried a penalty of 10 days of penance. And if you remember in Matthew 25, when Jesus condemns those who refuse to help the hungry, unhoused, sick, and imprisoned, he places them at God's left hand. Now, this is interesting to me as a left-handed man. I began to wonder if that's why some of the elders talk about how their teachers force them to use their right hand. And I read that most left-handed people have ambidextrous skills of one sort or another, probably because their right-handed parents, teachers, and coaches taught them the only way they knew how to use scissors, throw a ball, etc. We did a little research and found these notes. First, Many ancient cultures designated the right hand as the clean hand to be used for eating and greeting others, and the left hand as the dirty hand to be used for maintaining personal hygiene, especially regarding urination and defecation. Number 2, during the Inquisition, left-handedness was sufficient to sentence a woman to death as a witch. Many innocent left-handed people were executed in this way. Number 3, in the Middle Ages, left-handed people were often accused of witchcraft and burned at the stake because the devil was considered left-handed. In the early 1900s, some psychologists and criminologists considered left-hand people to be primitive, abnormal, stubborn, rebellious, and even rigid. Catholic teachers, this is the last note, Catholic teachers also disciplined their left-handed students in an effort to force them to use their right hands. We saw a story about an instance in 1995 when a kindergartner attended a Catholic school in Colorado, returned home with his left wrist wrapped in twine and on the other end of the twine tied to his belt loop. He told his mother the teacher told him that the left hand was the devil's hand and that I could not use it to write. Aversion to using the left hand was more custom than law in Israel. Still, most avoided using their left hand whenever possible. So think about it. The only way one could be struck on the right cheek without the other using his left hand was with a backhand slap. And although a backhand slap is still physical assault, typically it was not done to do harm, but it was an insult. Thus, by telling his hearers to turn the other cheek, Jesus, it appears, was simply telling them not to respond to insults, rather than telling them to submit themselves to physical harm or destruction. But this was more than a simple insult. It was a humiliating reminder of powerlessness and inferior status. You see, masters backhanded slaves, Romans backhanded Jews, husbands backhanded wives, parents backhanded children. Because of their powerlessness, the only prudent way those who were struck in this manner could respond was to acknowledge their inferior status with hung-head shame and silent humiliation. That is what Jesus seemed to advise. But when we look more closely at the gospel account, we see that Jesus counseled not resignation and passivity, but a definite action to offer the other cheek. Why? Because by taking an action, the powerless and the oppressed became more than victims. They became human beings who asserted their humanity, their somebodyness. By turning the other cheek, they took back their dignity and refused to be defined by those in power. Instead, they defined themselves, and their self-definition was this: we are not inferior beings. Rather, their voluntary submission to additional insult says, strike me again, insult me again, but I no longer care what you think of me. I now define myself. Thus, turning the other cheek made a bold statement of equality of humanity and self-worth. Even if those who were dominated were struck again, it was on their own terms. They had dictated the action in the sense that the one striking and the one being struck were now both active participants in the act. They had become equals. In a word, turning the other cheek was an act of self-determination. So for Jesus, turning the other cheek was not passivity, but a way for those who were the subjects of domination and abuse to take back their own dignity and their own power. When those who had been bullied and humiliated no longer acknowledged the thoughts of those who assaulted them as important, the myth of the assailant superiority was derailed and the whole edifice of their power was brought into question. Dr. Walter Wink gives us a testimony to the power of turning the other cheek. Wink, an American biblical scholar who was active in South Africa's struggle for freedom, tells of a black woman walking with her children on a South African street when a white man suddenly spit in her face. Instead of responding with anger, the woman turned to the angry man and responded, "Thank you. And now for the children." His assertion of power was thwarted, so much so that the offender went away without another word, confused and perhaps even shamed. Jesus' instruction to, quote, give him your cloak as well, unquote, makes a similar statement. Wink explains that typically poor Jews in Israel owned only two garments, an outer garment or coat and an undergarment. Poor people often pledged their outer garments as collateral for loans to pay taxes and other debts. This practice is reflected in Exodus 22, 25, and 26. If you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not treat it like a business deal. Charge no interest. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it by sunset. Using an outer garment to secure a loan usually meant the borrower owned nothing else. For lenders, much prefer land as collateral. So the scenario Jesus addressed in this instance is most likely referring to a poor person being sued for default on a loan. Not just being sued, however, but sued for literally everything they own but his undergarment. That makes Jesus' instruction, quote, give him your cloak as well, unquote, even more curious, because it meant going beyond the ruling of the court and giving up everything, including undergarments. Of course, Jesus was not counseling his listeners to engage in public nudity. He was using hyperbole and deliberately graphic exaggeration to make his point. In fact, he might have been alluding to the prophetic protest of Isaiah, who, according to Isaiah 23, walked naked and barefoot for 3 years to publicly make his point. But an even closer look shows that with this statement, Jesus was telling his listeners two very important things. First, he communicated that their plight was not just an unfortunate unfolding of the natural scheme of things. It was unjust and against the law of God. By Jesus' time, lending for interest to fellow Jews in need had become big business. Yet, the Bible had laws forbidding it. So the whole business of lending for profit was a transgression in the sight of God. In other words, the people's poverty was not the result of laziness or incompetence. It was the result of the greed of others. To be poor while others are rich and have to pay to borrow what should be freely lent, if not freely given, is not the way of God's kingdom. Even as I'm speaking, I'm sure you're thinking payday loans and high interest income tax refund advances and loan sharks and adjustable rate mortgages that pretty much crashed the housing market some years back. It was warned against in the Old Testament and remains an issue even now, all these centuries and decades later. Jesus' second point was that his hearers should not passively comply with unjust practices. Rather than accept the unjust status quo, they should protest the injustice of forced impoverishment. That's what give them your cloak as well means. Telling those in power, take it all, even my undergarments, is a public protest and a prophetic critique of a system that shows itself willing to strip people of all that they own in favor of those who are more than they. But take my cloak as well is also an assertion of personal agency. It declares you cannot exercise your power by taking it from me because I already exercise my power by giving it to you. In the text, Jesus said, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. This is morphed into the popular saying, go the extra mile, which refers to doing more than one is asked as a gesture of goodwill or love. But that is not the meaning of Jesus' statement. He is not telling his listeners to work hard to win over others. He is referring to a practice under Roman law that allowed a soldier to force a Jewish subject to carry the soldier's load for up to 1 mile. It was yet another humiliating Roman practice from which no Jew was safe. This was invoked upon Simon of Cyrene in Mark 15:21 to compel him to carry Jesus' cross to Golgotha. The practice was so frequently used and abused that Rome eventually passed special legislation to regulate it. It is to this practice that Jesus referred when he said, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. But again, he was not telling his listeners to try to win a soldier's heart with kindness. He was telling them how to turn a humiliating experience into an assertion of their own power and humanity. That by choosing to bear a load for another mile, they announced that they were not beasts of burden, that they were engaging in an act of self-determination. They were doing what they themselves had decided. As a result, they proclaimed their humanity and reclaimed their dignity from what could have been a pure public humiliation. This was particularly important for a man in that culture because the Romans often sought to shame men in the presence of their families. So what Jesus taught in each of these instructions was how to assert one's power in the face of a more powerful opponent, and how his followers could fight evil without being transformed into the evil that had confronted them. Jesus taught how to resist without resorting to violence. Jesus presented a way by which evil can be opposed without being mirrored. The oppressor resisted without being emulated, and the enemy neutralized without being destroyed. In other words, what Jesus taught was passive resistance. Dr. Wink describes passive resistance, which is also called nonviolence, as a commitment to respect the sacredness of each person, whatever their class or role, while maintaining a resolute determination to overcome all forms of domination. Its goal is to attain justice in order to have true peace. That doesn't mean that one is not to resist injustice fiercely. Passive resistance is not passivity, nor is it cowardness. It is a deep commitment to changing the world around us without sacrificing any measure of our humanity. It does not seek to avoid conflict or to shrink from the responsibility to take sides. As we get closer to the end of this Bible study series, I hope that those who are listening will choose the side of freedom over oppression, right over wrong, love over hate, and justice over evil. One of the earliest recorded examples of nonviolent resistance is the Exodus account of the Hebrews' midwives, who refused to obey Pharaoh's command to kill Hebrew infants. The biblical book of Daniel, chapters 3 and 6, recounts disobedience to the ruler's edict. The strategy of nonviolent resistance was also used successfully in Israel during Jesus' lifetime. In AD 26, Pontius Pilate ordered Roman ensigns to be flown in the Jerusalem temple. This caused great consternation among Jews who considered it blasphemous. For 5 days, thousands prostrated themselves around Pilate's house in protest. Eventually, Pilate threatened to kill the protesters if they did not disperse. Rather than fleeing, however, the demonstrators bared their necks to the surrounding soldiers, pledging to die rather than accept Pilate's blasphemy. Realizing the depth of the people's resolve to resist him, Pilate could do no more than withdraw the offensive symbols. In the 20th century, the power of nonviolent resistance was successfully used again and again. A number of Asian and African countries freed themselves from the choking grasp of so-called Christian empires by means of nonviolent resistance, like India and Ghana, who were among the first. Dictators in El Salvador and Guatemala were ousted by widespread nonviolent resistance. With its campaign of passive resistance, the African National Congress brought down the brutal South African apartheid regime. Its cause was aided by the highly publicized student protests that eventually persuaded 60% of all American colleges and universities to divest themselves of South African investments, either in whole or in part. This may call to mind how some colleges and universities have been and have done the same in response to the conflict going on now. We've even seen this locally at VCU and at UVA. In the United States, the nonviolent civil rights struggle used economic boycotts, massive demonstrations, marches, sit-ins, freedom rides to dismantle legalized white supremacy. Relentless, nonviolent confrontations with the United States government also helped to end the Vietnam War. In his book, Dr. Hendricks brings up a question he's often asked: how could Jesus teach passive resistance, then turn around and instruct his followers with, quote, "do not resist evildoers," unquote? Again, he returns to Dr. Wink, who explains that the term translated in Matthew 5:39 as resist, in that case, apparently means more than resist. Often this term was used by the military to mean to set against or withstand, as in Ephesians 6:13. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, so that you may be able to withstand on that evil day and stand firm. It is also the term used most often in the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, to denote military resistance. In other words, rather than being translated simply as "do not resist an evildoer," Matthew 5:39 should be more accurately understood as meaning "do not violently resist evil." Do you hear the difference? Therefore, what Jesus taught his followers was that they should not resist evil by resorting to violence. They should not fight evil with evil, violence with violence, and neither should they diminish their own humanity by mimicking their oppressors' inhumanity. Jesus' teaching of nonviolent resistance sought to prevent the violent backlash and retaliation that will result from violent resistance. In this passage, Jesus was not just teaching personal morality. He was telling his listeners how they could use their meager power to resist assaults on their humanity by those who lorded over them. Realizing that they did not have military might, Jesus was telling his hearers to use the power they did have. How does nonviolent resistance work on a practical level? As Wink points out, the primary goal of nonviolent resistance is the conversion of opponents to one's cause by appealing to their sense of decency and justice. Thus, nonviolent or passive resistance has one purpose: to overcome injustice. It exposes the depth of the inequity by showing the lengths of self-sacrifice to which people will go to oppose it. Yet, because the opponents of nonviolent resistance are not crushed or humiliated, the strategy offers a basis for reconciliation. The 1960s were not only turbulent, for many they were dangerous and deadly. This was certainly the case for civil rights activists in the Deep South. Many were beaten and tortured and maimed, while others were murdered. More often than not, homicidal racists committed their evil deeds with impunity. Few were indicted for their crimes, and only a handful were ever convicted. As a result, violence against those who sought to gain full dignity and rights for all Americans were virtually unchecked. Yet, most civil rights workers did not respond to the attacks with violence. They did not fight back when attacked. They didn't even defend themselves. In the face of dangerous mobs, they didn't respond. Many observers saw their passivity as stupid, if not suicidal. Yet the nonviolence of those civil rights workers was not passivity in the face of violent attack. It was a profound enactment of Jesus' strategy of passive resistance. The purpose of their passive resistance was to overcome injustice without repaying evil for evil. Thus, Jesus' strategy of taking blows without returning them means self-sacrificial leadership. It means that one is willing to sacrifice in order to make this world of wholeness and justice and love that the Gospels say it should be. If you look at Jesus' life and ministry, there are actions and elements of Jesus' nonviolent teaching that includes principles and characteristics successfully used by Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, even now, Dr. William Barber, Fannie Lou Hamer, and other freedom fighters down through the ages. In the book, Hendricks identifies several. Seize the moral initiative. Find a creative alternative to violence. Assert your own humanity and dignity as a person. Meet force with ridicule or humor. Break the cycle of humiliation. Refuse to submit to or to accept the inferior position. Expose the injustice of the system. Take control of the power or dynamic. Shame the oppressor into repentance. Stand your ground. Force those in power to make decisions for which they have not prepared. Recognize your own power. Be willing to suffer rather than retaliate. Force the oppressor to see you in a new light. Deprive the oppressor of a situation in which a show of force is necessary or effective. Be willing to undergo the penalty for breaking unjust laws. Die to fear of the old order and its rules. Seek the oppressor's transformation. Not everyone is willing to make sacrifices to treat the people's needs as holy. That's understandable. But anyone who is not willing to endure some measure of sacrifice for the welfare of others is not qualified to be a leader. According to the politics of Jesus, those in positions of leadership, secular or religious, who are self-important and always seeking self-aggrandizement, are not worthy to lead the people because they do not treat the people's needs as holy. Jesus said that the one who leads must be a servant of all. That means that a leader must be willing to bear the cross of self-sacrificial leadership in hopes of earning the crown bestowed by those precious words, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." That's why I do what I do. At the church and in the community, I want to make sure that people's lives are better because of my leadership as a pastor and my work as a public servant. I know that there are some in both camps who are never happy with the decisions that I make or some stances that I may take. And often, when people don't like something I say or do, they get angry. And in their anger, they may respond in a way that's disrespectful, that's rude, that's insulting, sometimes even racist. And I thought as we, did this, I've been on the side of an organization that pulled together churches and clergy and served as a chair of that for a while. They tried to push elected officials to do the right thing by trying to morally push them or use power or whatever. I've been on the other side where groups have tried to push me. I've been the pusher and the pushed, and I've been able to see it on both sides. It's not easy doing this work. Sometimes it can weigh on you. People are not always the nicest, and you try to look at the good, and they get so passionate about what they are pushing for, and that their thing is the most important thing. That when you don't do what they want you to do, it can get really ugly. And there's some people are just straight up haters of humanity, and they don't like you just because of the color of your skin or the gender or your belief system. Or, I had a conversation earlier with a young lady that was thinking about leadership in the future. She's young and white, and I was just trying to tell her that the journey of your predecessor is not going to be your journey. His journey is going to be easier than yours for multiple reasons. First of all, because you're young and you're a woman. There are multiple reasons that people are going to find to not accept you and your work and your calling and what you do. And you just got to be committed to it. And so the work is not easy. I in no way compare what I do to the fights of humanity that have gone on before. But even in the smallest cases, it can get hard when you're trying to do what's right, what you believe to be right. And people on the other side push against it for whatever reasons. So, I've had to take blows without returning them. And that, I'm going to tell you, that's the most humbling part of all of this. Sometimes I do want to fight. I'm not going to lie. Sometimes I type out emails and then I got to delete them. I type text, then I got to delete them. Sometimes I posted stuff and then after a minute or two, I'm like, you got to delete that. It's not easy. It's difficult. And sometimes I'm close to saying what I really want to say. But I represent the kingdom, represent other clergy, represent my family, represent, 6 Mount Zion, its members, the county of Henrico, the residents, And it's just, I got too much to lose. Too much I'm fighting for. So some days, like the song, order my steps, I've got to pray that the Lord bridle my tongue, hold my hand, so that I can take the blows without returning them. That concludes today's Bible study. And I hope you share this Bible study and then come back next week when we talk about the seventh and final political strategy that impacted Jesus' life and ministry. We are now 13 days from election. So if you've not voted, watch this Bible study. Watch these Bible studies. And make sure your candidates line up with what we believe the politics of Jesus is. Now, as we get ready for After Bible Study Chat, I want to hear your response to this question. What do you remember being taught about turning the other cheek? And do you find it easy or difficult? In the After Bible Study Chat, we want to play for you a story told by one of Dr. Wink's students of how he learned the lesson of turning the other cheek. All right, it's time to head over to After Bible Study Chat. You can get there 3 different ways. Download the Dialpad Meetings app or go to meetings.dialpad.com/SMZBC or simply call 804-203-9011.